like to finish on a personal note sometimes when I make these introductions. I want to say that Nick is a true pleasure to work with. He even answers emails promptly. It's just amazing. So please give a major Channing House welcome to Dr. Nicholas Shakirski.
So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me again here at the Channing House. It's been almost 10 years since I gave, I believe, my first talk here at Channing, and the title of that talk was Poland Today. So you can treat this as a kind of an update. Maybe I'll come once every 10 years, well, maybe more often if you'll have me, but pleasure again to be here. Few countries in modern history have suffered the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune like Poland. More than 100 years after the country was dismembered by three surrounding empires, Russia among them, she regained independence in 1918.
Just a minute, hold on. Go.
In large part thanks to the American Relief Administration, led by Herbert Hoover. This fledgling independence was shielded and nurtured through massive supplies of food and aid that helped Poland weather the storm of war in 1920 against the Bolshevik Red Army, also Russia, though in Soviet form. I had the opportunity to speak about this at my last Channing House talk several years ago. Shortly afterwards, I defended my PhD thesis on the subject in Warsaw, just 2 days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. Just 2 decades after regaining independence in 1918, Poland was torn apart again, this time as the result of the Hitler-Stalin Pact and the German and Soviet invasions that soon followed in September 1939. Despite valiant resistance by the Polish underground in the country and the tremendous sacrifices of Polish soldiers fighting at the side of the Allies in the West, Poland would lose the eastern half of its territory, which is now largely part of modern-day Ukraine and Belarus, and all of its independence, becoming a satellite of the Soviet Union until 1989. Though it wasn't until 1991 when Red Army troops began to leave Poland, and 1993, already after the Soviet Union had collapsed, that the final Russian soldiers left the country, so just 31 years ago. The history of the Ukrainian nation is no less tumultuous. But besides 2 short-lived republics immediately following World War I, the Ukrainians would not take control of their own state until 1991. Years of Soviet domination had a lasting effect that persists to this day, from the heavy Russification of the culture, though the past few years have seen it increasingly purged from public life, to essentially Russian colonization of a large part of the country, especially in the eastern Donbass region and Crimea, areas occupied by Russia since the conflict began in 2014. My last exhibition at the Hoover Library and Archives focused on the democratic revolutions across Eastern Europe as communism fell. The final display case was dedicated to the events that unfolded in Ukraine in late 2013, with protests after then-President Viktor Yanukovych refused to sign an association agreement with the EU and instead chose to deepen ties with Russia. This would lead to violent clashes and the ultimate ouster of Yanukovych in what was known as the Revolution of Dignity, or the Maidan Revolution, which marked the beginning of the conflict we are witnessing today. The homemade signs and leaflets on display then were collected by the Robert Conquest Curator for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia at the Library and Archives, Dr. Anatol Shmelev, a speaker at Channing House not long ago. The invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation on February 24, 2022, marked a dramatic escalation in that conflict, which began a decade ago. Poland played and continues to play an indispensable role as an ally of Ukraine in its valiant defense against the Russian forces, both directly in terms of military aid, along with facilitating its transfer through Polish territory. It also supports more than 1 million Ukrainian citizens, primarily women and children, through social welfare programs and private charity. The Herculean efforts by the Poles to aid the Ukrainians in the critical first weeks and months of the war cannot be underestimated. Heavy armaments, including over 300 tanks, mostly T-72s, but also modern Leopards, 350 armored personnel carriers, 74 self-propelled Crab artillery with a 40-kilometer range and a 155-millimeter shell, 14 MiG-29 fighter jets, 12 Mi-24 attack helicopters, and the Piorun, or Lightning, anti-aircraft system, among many other items. This materiel was vital in the early battles, buying time for the arrival of more advanced Western equipment, like the HIMARS rocket artillery, for which deliveries only began in June of 2022. Of the smaller armaments Poland has also given, more than 10,000 Grot rifles, Poland's most advanced main battle rifle, and has also trained over 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Most of the weapons, equipment, and aid continue to be transferred by land through unmarked border crossings from Poland to Ukraine, having earlier landed at the Rzeszów airport in southeastern Poland, the hub for the majority of aid to Ukraine since 2022. In total, about 40 military aid packages have been signed by Poland for Ukraine, totaling approximately $3.7 billion in military materiel. Poland is also continuously serving as an equipment repair hub for Ukraine, with damaged and worn-out tanks and other vehicles and machines being shipped back across the border to be fixed and refurbished. While the transfer of military supplies severely depleted Poland's stocks, it has also served as a strong motivator, and for many other NATO countries as well, to overhaul and modernize their militaries. Poland will spend over $41 billion on defense in 2024, nearly 4% of the country's GDP. While Poland is left with about 500 tanks after sending so many to Ukraine, many of them outdated, in 2023, Poland signed an agreement to purchase 115 Abrams M1A1 tanks from the U.S., 43 of which have been delivered, and more will arrive this year. Next year, 125 of the most modern M1A2 Abrams tanks will arrive. Add to this close to 200 South Korean K2 tanks between now and 2025. A framework agreement to purchase another 820 K2 tanks has been signed, most of which will be built in Poland. The country intends to have the most formidable armored corps in Europe. Hundreds of HIMARS rocket artillery are also planned for purchase, though it's unclear how many will ultimately arrive. The massive Polish and Western military deliveries to Ukraine in her time of desperate need, a reply to President Zelensky's early appeal, "I need ammunition, not a ride," staunched the bleeding on the front lines, while a massive human wave of Ukrainian refugees and foreign nationals seeking to escape the war zone flooded into EU countries, most of all to Poland. More than 3 million Ukrainians, close to 10% of the pre-war population of the country, have passed through Poland since 2022, with approximately 1 million staying for the long term and receiving Polish social security numbers and associated benefits. This is a point of contention for many Poles who question whether the relatively meager benefits that they've earned over an adult lifetime of work should also be granted to Ukrainian citizens, who aren't all, of course, desperate and penniless. This is just a personal anecdote, but I've seen as many Teslas with Ukrainian license plates in Warsaw as I have with Polish ones. While the most affluent Ukrainians are just a fraction of the whole, they've disproportionately fled their country, many avoiding mandatory military service this way. Like Russia, Ukraine also has its class of oligarchs and post-Soviet nomenclatura who've made their fortunes through nepotism and corruption, to the great detriment of the vast majority of the Ukrainian people. Ukraine will have to deal with this situation if it hopes to become an EU member. More than 2 years into the full-scale war, the dynamic between Poland and Ukraine has decidedly changed. The failure of the much-vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive, which lasted from last summer until the fall, has dampened support for the Ukrainian cause, where the largely unexpected and successful counteroffensive a year earlier in late 2022, which led to the retaking of Kharkiv and the surrounding region, bolstered morale both in Ukraine and beyond. A series of other issues have led to friction between the two countries, most visibly the so-called grain crisis, which began in April of last year. Deprived of their traditional transport route for grain and other agricultural products through the Black Sea due to the Russian naval blockade, the Ukrainians have been transporting most of their exports by rail and truck through Poland. Much of these items, grain especially, has made it onto the Polish market, severely undercutting Polish farmers. Parallel to this, Ukrainian trucking companies are an increasingly larger force in the EU market, also severely undercutting their competition. The backlash has seen Polish truckers and farmers blockading border crossings between the two countries, limiting the number of transports that can pass, and going so far as to spill the grain out of several rail cars onto the tracks in one incident that the farmers who did it claimed would be unsealed in Lithuania, receive the appropriate paperwork, and return to be dumped back on the Polish market. Though directly related to the Ukraine war and its secondary effects, the trucker and farmer protests are also in line with a broader EU-wide protest against increasingly severe restrictions being put on the agricultural sector by the European Commission, essentially putting many farmers out of business by exponentially increasing costs. These regulations are part of the European Green Deal, approved by the Commission in 2020 to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. This is increasingly seen as an unrealistic and perhaps even destructive goal, especially given the grave challenges that Europe faces, most notably Russia's revived imperial ambitions. The central player in the European Union is Germany, and much of the challenges facing Europe now are a result of German policies. For decades prior to the warfare that we are witnessing now, Germany was Russia's best customer for oil and gas imports. Hundreds of billions of euros were transferred to Putin's regime, which both served to bolster the military, which is fighting in Ukraine now, and helped to entrench the oligarchic system in Russia. The final certification for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, meant to deliver gas directly from Russia to Germany, was nearing completion when the invasion began. This would have offered Russia a massive tool for leveraging its political influence over Europe through energy. German policy over the past few decades, especially, has been to build relations with Russia through energy dealings as a limit on Russian territorial ambitions. After all, if you're making billions of dollars on energy every month, why would you invade a neighbor of your customers? Unfortunately, this policy failed. And here I'll show you the first slide, and this is the natural gas imports coming from Russia as of 2020. So you can see how heavily all of the countries bordering Russia and Ukraine as well were were dependent on Russian imports, which has been over the last few years. They've severely curtailed them, although Russian energy is still making its way into Europe through various means. Of course, energy is a vital resource that you can't get around needing. At the start of the invasion, Germany imported roughly 50% of all of its gas and oil from Russia. Although that has been severely curtailed since then, the demand for energy to power the world's fourth largest economy remains. Given the historic tendency of Germany to gravitate towards Russia, a phenomenon that has yielded catastrophic effects for Europe in the 20th century, Poland's position, as well as Ukraine's, between the two major powers continues to be precarious. Regrettably, early hopes for closer political ties between Poland and Ukraine, even radical suggestions of a federation between the two, have evaporated. Ukraine, and most visibly its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, aspire to membership in the EU as an opportunity for tremendous economic advancement, not to mention potential investment and reconstruction capital that Ukraine sorely needs. As the deciding force in the bloc due to its economic position, Germany has therefore become the preferred partner for engagement. The tremendous risk that this brings for Ukraine, however, is the stark reality that Moscow is a much more important player, not to mention a past and hoped to be future economic and political partner for Berlin. While on paper Germany's support to Ukraine is second only to the United States, the glaring reality of Germany's wait-and-see approach in the critical early phase of the war was highly indicative of Berlin's anticipation of a rapid Ukrainian defeat. Presumably, they expected a quick coming to terms and resumption of relations with Russia before any serious sanctions or the wholesale cutting off of energy imports could be contemplated. While Poland and others were sending tanks and artillery, Germany was dithering for weeks. Immediately before the invasion, they refused to provide even defensive weapons, instead drawing mockery for promising 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. The US and the UK were sending Javelin anti-tank launchers and anti-aircraft weapons at the same time. And I'll show this slide in just a little bit, but while at first glance, the periodically updated list of German supplies currently being delivered to Ukraine now is impressive, upon closer inspection, one sees a plethora of asterisks referring to a footnote stating that these are, quote, deliveries from industry stocks financed by German funds for security capacity building. Some of the deliveries require upgrades or production is ongoing. Also, training measures take place, meaning that many of these so-called deliveries are still paper promises that the Ukrainians are waiting for. Out of 215 equipment items listed, there are 150 asterisks. Add to this the recent and critical decision by the German government not to provide Ukraine with Taurus ballistic missiles with a 500-kilometer range for fear of escalating the conflict. This was a source of embarrassment recently when a presentation for Chancellor Scholz by senior German Air Force officers about the Taurus and its potential for destroying the bridge connecting the Russian mainland with the Crimean Peninsula was tapped by the Russians and released to the public. Germany is also perpetually behind on its own military spending, consistently failing to achieve the 2% of GDP standard accepted by NATO. According to some estimates, Germany is as much as 300 to 350 billion euros, or about $320 to $375 billion, behind in defense spending. Thankfully, Ukraine does not have to rely on Germany as the primary provider of military aid. The $60 billion in funding recently passed by the U.S. House of Representatives and hopefully soon to be approved by the Senate. I didn't check the news today, so I don't think they voted on it yet. They did, it passed, okay. Okay, all right, so it did pass. It's of singular importance to Ukraine's future. There's no getting around the fact that there's a profound leadership vacuum in Europe and that the United States is and will be for the foreseeable future the linchpin of the continent's security. Of course, this is not an indefinitely sustainable situation. And I'll just note here that it's a difficult situation because the U.S., the involvement of the U.S. in Europe after World War II was critical to European stability, of course, and the eventual development of the European Union. But at the same time, there's a lot of strong resentment towards America, you would call it anti-Americanism even, especially in Germany and France. There was Dr. Russell Berman of the Hoover Institution wrote about anti-Americanism in Europe about 15 or 16 years ago, but it's an ongoing theme. But on the other hand, there is no one really to replace the United States. It's indispensable to Europe. In 2017, Dr. Thomas Henriksen, also senior fellow emeritus at the Hoover Institution, wrote the book Cycles in U.S. Foreign Policy Since the Cold War, and I assisted with its editing. It highlights the periodic engagement and withdrawal of U.S. involvement in world affairs. I would argue that although America has not been engaged in full-scale wars since Afghanistan and Iraq, the height of which were nearly 20 years ago, a consistent level of engagement abroad has been ratcheting up higher in the 21st century. The ongoing threat from Russia and the gathering confrontation with China does not allow for a period of respite. Couple this with the American people's understandable fatigue and frustration from over 20 years of constant flashpoints across the globe, and apparently never-ending expenditures of resources, especially on allies who have yet to fully shoulder the burden of their own defense. I was heartened to hear Rose Gottmuller's assessment at the last Channing House talk about the role played by former President Donald Trump in putting pressure on NATO allies, especially Germany, to increase their defense spending. I believe this was necessary to light a fire under the alliance, and I think it was far-sighted, especially as it came 5 years before Russia's attack on Ukraine. Political differences aside, though, I think both the policies of President Biden and former President Trump are largely in line with America's Cold War policies towards NATO and Russia, which I think are repeating themselves to a large extent today. And I wouldn't expect any dramatic changes in that regard, irrespective of who wins the election in November. Following a meeting with Polish President Andrzej Duda last Wednesday, Trump affirmed that he was behind Poland all the way and that the survival of Ukraine is important to the United States, almost certainly tipping the scales in favor of the recently passed foreign aid bill, indicating that election time rhetoric is not the same as concrete policy realities. The $60 billion in funding that will soon be flowing into Ukraine in the form of military hardware and economic assistance, and this follows $133 billion already spent by the U.S., should be seen as buying time, not only for Ukraine, but for the entire NATO alliance. $120 billion in orders have been placed with U.S. defense contractors by EU countries last year. Of course, the fulfillment of these orders is a years-long process. For Poland in particular, this should be a time for maximally strengthening not only its military capabilities, but its logistical capacity and economic growth. Unfortunately, the recently elected government in Warsaw is not inclined to pursue such a direction as strongly as it should when it conflicts with German interests. I highlight some of these troubling signals in my most recent newsletter, which I invite you to read on my website, researchteacher.com, entitled Storm Clouds Over Poland. It's not out of the question, of course, that rapidly developing threats will force current and future leaders in Poland to take dramatic action to protect the nation's security. One such recent indication was the statement by Polish President Duda that if our allies decide to deploy nuclear weapons as part of nuclear sharing on our territory as well, in order to strengthen the security of NATO's eastern flank, we are ready for it. This is a response to Russia's increased militarization of the Kaliningrad Oblast, which was formerly the German Königsberg until it was taken in World War II by the Soviets, and the relocation of nuclear weapons to Belarus. The ongoing modernization of NATO's air forces also provides substantial reassurance, namely the continued introduction of the F-35, the fifth-generation fighter produced in the United States and the most advanced fighter plane in the world. Poland is set to receive between 4 and 6 of them this year, with that many being delivered each year until 2030. NATO as a whole already fields 120 F-35s, with as many as 600 total being in service within a decade, an amazing threat deterrent against Russia. Nearly 1,000 F-35s have been built thus far, with the majority in America's arsenal. Its closest comparable fighter adversary, the Su-57, is less capable, and the Russians may only have a few dozen total in service. Ukraine is also slated to receive F-16 fighter planes, which will substantially enhance their defensive capacity against Russia, though probably won't seriously change the situation on the ground. The planes themselves are, of course, just one part of the equation. The training is 9 months long for each pilot, a highly selective training process, and a squadron of 12 planes requires roughly 250 ground personnel, technicians, logisticians, and others, not to mention serious anti-air defenses to maintain. Those will be prime targets once they are operational, those bases. The logistical supply chain will certainly extend back into Poland and other NATO countries, something that the Russians have repeatedly said is a legitimate target to strike, although they haven't done it yet. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and a highly respected geostrategist who passed away in 2017, argued in the early 90s that Poland's alliance with Ukraine was even more important than NATO in checking Russian imperialism. To a large extent, his prediction has come true, though it's both NATO and Ukraine, with the latter essentially being an unofficial candidate member to NATO, upon which Poland's security rests. At the same time, it's in Ukraine's interest to maintain good relations with Poland as the lifeline through which this life-saving aid and a transit corridor for its citizens is maintained. I can add that my father, Dr. Maciej Siekierski, then curator of the European collection at Hoover, tried to acquire his papers before Dr. Brzezinski passed away, but he had already committed them elsewhere. Brzezinski also noted that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine suborned and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. And let me show you some more of these slides here. Many of these are photos that I took. Here we have the central station in Warsaw about 10 days after the invasion. Most of the people here are Ukrainians, and I was on my way to Poznań, Poland, and most of them were also on their way to the west, albeit to Germany and other countries in Europe. I remember helping some of them with their luggage. You could see that they were very much shocked, you could say, by the experiences of the past few weeks. So I remember those dramatic moments. As I mentioned, the invasion started 2 days after I defended my doctorate in Warsaw, so of course it was all over the news, and it became a very big deal in Poland, and it still is, although after 2 years it's changed a bit. Here you have the Palace of Culture, which was a gift, quote unquote, from Stalin after World War II. So Warsaw was totally destroyed after the war, and this was built in the middle there, but it's lit up in the Ukrainian flag colors. And this is just a coincidence, but Warsaw's colors are also similar to the Ukrainian flag for all their public transportation. And then you had various signs and symbols throughout the city, and that continues to this day. We have graffiti here. Putin, you murderer, you're sentencing people to death. And that was in Warsaw. I would have preferred that it was on a sign and not on the brand new bench that they had just built. And then here you had someone set up a dartboard, and they were collecting money for the Ukrainians, so you could hit Putin there. And then here you have one of the Crab artillery. So this is one of about 70 that were sent to Ukraine, and these are built in Poland. This is during the Polish military parade in the middle of August every year, which celebrates the defeat of the Red Army at the gates of Warsaw in 1920. This was the height of the Polish Bolshevik War, and thanks to that, Poland, of course, was saved, but also much of Europe also could have been saved from the expansion of Bolshevik Russia and the communist revolution that they were seeking to carry to Germany at that time. I mentioned here the list of German supplies for Ukraine, and you can see all the little asterisks everywhere. So like I said, on the surface it looks impressive, but it's not clear how much of it is actually making it there. I don't want to come off as too, critical of Germany, but that's something it's worth emphasizing because it doesn't get talked about very much. Germany is the big economy in Europe. It's the superpower of Europe, the fourth largest economy in the world, and there's more that they need to do, not just in providing aid, but in playing a leadership role in NATO and in Europe. Here we had tanks that were in the Old Town of Warsaw. So if anyone has ever been to Old Town Warsaw, this is right in front of the Royal Castle, and this is a damaged or destroyed Russian tank, and several of these were brought as a way to show, to make the war more real for people. So these were taken around different cities in Europe, and that's the Royal Castle there, which was totally destroyed at the end of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. The German military had drilled holes into the basement and put dynamite into it, and they blew it up at the end. It was finally rebuilt in the 1970s. And then again, another artillery piece in Old Town Warsaw. Here we have an initiative of a friend of mine, and there are a lot of similar initiatives. These are Ukrainian soldiers who received supplies from Polish donations, and they have these certificates with the names of the various donors, people who gave money to the cause. And the symbol that's used there, it was of a union that never occurred. It was a union that was proposed between Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. This was in the 1600s. It never came to fruition, and it was revived during one of the Polish revolts against the Russians in the 19th century. And the initiative here is to get some Ukrainians to wear it. This is a military patch here as a way of building ties between the countries, because that's really the strongest defense, is building more ties and connections between the countries that immediately border Russia. And Poland and Ukraine, I think, are two of the best candidates for that. This is the friend I mentioned, Dariusz in the hat, and he was in Ukraine delivering aid on one of many, of dozens of trips that he's made there, very close to the war zone. And he happened to be at a gas station, and a Ukrainian overheard that there was a Polish guy here, so he spontaneously went to him to thank him. And actually, he gave him, or to hold, at least for the picture, the Polish Grot rifle, which I mentioned. So it shows how they're using the rifles there. Over 15,000 of them are on the battlefields of Ukraine. Here's another initiative that my friend was involved in. This is the grave of a young Ukrainian who was killed 2 years ago, a year and a half ago roughly. And he had a very strong patriotic sentiment towards Poland as well, a strong affinity towards Poland. And before he died, maybe he kind of was foreseeing his own death. He said he wanted both the Ukrainian and Polish flags on his grave. This was the provisional grave initially, and then the later tombstone. Here you have Ukrainian children. They're receiving backpacks as part of an initiative, one of many Polish initiatives, in this case, the Foundation of the Memory of Nations. And you have the symbolic Polish flag colors on the umbrella protecting against the Russian bombs, and then the Ukrainian family there. We had a lot of VIPs in Warsaw, and here we had President Biden driving by. So this is a picture I took when he was driving by one of the central streets in Warsaw. President Biden was in Warsaw twice in the past 2 years. Kamala Harris was there, Vice President Kamala Harris. And so I saw them three or four times when I'm in Warsaw. I live downtown, so it's very close to see it. So that was a fun atmosphere just to see the President of the United States driving by. And then also giving a speech. This is the back of the Royal Castle. So before you saw the front, and this is the back, and President Biden, who is, you can see him behind the bulletproof glass on the right bottom side there, but he gave a speech, very nice speech, in a very positive atmosphere last year in March. I believe it was March, since it was quite cold. Here's, I didn't mention too much of this, but there's, the history is inseparable from current events in Poland, in Eastern Europe, in Russia. And here you have the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister of Poland last year, Mateusz Morawiecki, praying in a place in western Ukraine where a Polish village used to be. During World War II, there was a terrible genocide against Poles that were living there by Ukrainians who were inspired by a very radical nationalist ideology, and over 100,000 Poles were very brutally killed. In this one case, there are hundreds of cases like these where the village no longer exists. The bodies were never appropriately buried, and this is one point of contention between Poland and Ukraine that I think and I hope will get resolved with time, but there just isn't the political will for it yet. But despite these, painful historical animosities, Poland nonetheless provided tremendous support to Ukraine, and I think there is a sense of perhaps resentment that we have given so much, and yet there's there's a lot of political calculations involved that undermine that goodwill. I think among average Ukrainians, there's great gratitude, there's great potential for building those relations, as I showed in a few of the photographs, but the politicians are much more looking for a political gain to be achieved. I mentioned the farmers' protests. We have the farmers here on the border. Stop for agricultural products from Ukraine. You're destroying our market. And then here I mentioned the incident where several tons of grain were spilled. It seems like the issue is going to be resolved. It all comes down to the controls that are going to be put in place to make sure that the grain is legitimately being transported to other destinations. Of course, it's cheaper and more lucrative to sell your products as close as possible rather than transporting them far away. But these are the types of issues that will need to be sorted out between Poland and Ukraine, especially as Ukraine desires to enter into the EU. A friend of mine is a poster artist, and he created this poster back in 2014. So Achtung, of course, is the German, and watch out for Russia. Attention, Russia. And he created this back in 2014, so it was also quite prophetic as to the threat posed by Russia. But you can say that the West was maybe didn't take that threat as seriously as they should have, and over the last 2 years we're really playing catch up. Here we have again the beautiful scenic Old Town, so the tanks were a little further past this, and I just wanted to put this picture here right towards the end because it just shows the idyllic, beautiful society that Poles have created and many other countries have created after communism, and how that's always at the front of mind for many Poles. They know their history well, and they know that potential, that threat for destruction and just control from Russia specifically is always a possibility. Here we have one more example from history. This is FDR meeting with Polish Polonia, or Polish diaspora members, in late 1944. So this is before his final election victory, where he was showing them the map of Poland with its pre-war borders and saying basically that that's how Poland would be after the war. Unfortunately, that reality did not happen, and Poland lost half of its territory. So Poland is well versed with what can happen as a result of wars. And while I hope Ukraine is able to keep and even recover as much territory as it can, it's quite possible that it will lose a substantial piece of territory, but we have to wait and see what will happen. And then here we have a map. I believe this is about as current as it gets with what Russia has occupied so far, and the black is what they've had since 2014, and the red is what they've taken since 2022. I think I want to end here on a kind of a hopeful note that since January, the Kremlin has seized 140 square miles of Ukrainian territory, roughly the size of Detroit, and that's according to the Washington-based Institute for the Study of War. Ukraine has a total area of 233,031 square miles. So Russia controls total about 38,610 square miles, or about 17% of the country. So it's, of course, it's not ideal. You want to get all of your country back, but 140 square miles over the last 4 months, paid at a tremendous price in soldiers and military equipment, of course, on the Ukrainian side as well. But it gives me some hope that Russia is not going to be able to take much more. But we'll see how that aid is used and what the next steps will be of the United States and, of course, of Europe. As someone who's closely studied World War II and its aftermath and simultaneously grew up over the past 40 years, arguably the most peaceful and prosperous in the history of the Western world, it's hard not to recognize that times are changing. By the middle of the century, we may look back upon the several decades leading up to 2020 as a type of golden age. I hope that's not the case, but history tells us that it's better to be prepared than to be caught flat-footed. As Thomas Jefferson wrote over 200 years ago, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. As Ukraine demonstrates the sacrifices necessary to resist imperial tyranny in the 21st century, Poland and NATO's eastern flank especially can't afford to let their guard down. I hope that Europe as a whole will be able to shoulder an increasing amount of the burden for its own defense, grateful as always that the United States has carried the lion's share for so long. Thank you very much for your attention. Be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Question time. Whoops. Let's
Question.
get a couple of microphones going here. And
So you mentioned Lithuania and Poland briefly with that patch.
Yeah.
They've had an on and off relationship since the 13th century.
Oh, yes.
So what's the relationship like now, given that Stalingrad's in the middle between them?
Kaliningrad.
I mean,
Yeah.
Kaliningrad.
Yeah, it's, there's, well, I think on the level of military cooperation, it's quite strong. Of course, there's historical issues and whatnot, and cultural differences too, but that's really a big question, because Kaliningrad and Belarus are both right up against what's called the Suwałki Gap, which is the area between, where Poland connects to Lithuania. So the assumption is that if there is a conflict with NATO, then the Russian forces and also Belarusian forces, or whatever they have there in both Kaliningrad and Belarus, will bridge that gap and cut off the Baltics from the rest of Europe, making a defense or sending aid very difficult. So I think it's about as clear as it gets. It's just a matter of having the resources, and the question is, how many resources do you want to send to an area that could be quickly overrun? So there are different concepts for how that defense could be provided, but I know that the Lithuanians and the Estonians and Latvians, they want as much on their land as possible, because it's easier to defend than it is to recover. So I would say, as far as I know, the relationship is quite good on an international level, and I think the more the threat grows, the closer they'll be, because they'll realize that whatever issues they have are less important than the potential for Russia attacking again.
Some supplemental information. When we toured Warsaw, we found out that the old town is a very new town. And what was told to us was that, fortunately, right before World War II, an architectural professor had his students totally document architecturally the old
Yes.
town. So then when it was destroyed in World War II, afterwards they were able to very accurately rebuild the town. So you have a very beautiful new old town there, thanks to a fortuitous circumstance.
Yes, it was rebuilt after the Second World War, so thankfully those drawings and whatever photographs they used were were used to rebuild the city. I think of it a little differently than many polls. Polls tend to be a bit more pessimistic, and they say, well, it's kind of like a Disneyland and it's not real. But for me, it's beautiful and it's lovely to see, and so I'm glad it's back. And I know that it's there's always the risk. And going back to this threat generally from Russia, it takes decades, generations to build the bridges and the buildings and the infrastructure and the highways, but it could take seconds of the bombs in the right places to destroy that, and then it may never be rebuilt. Going back to Germany for a moment, part of the issue that Germany has is that it also has a lot of infrastructure problems. This relates, the United States does too, with bridges that need to be rebuilt and roads and all of that. In Germany, this is also a huge problem. So it's on the one hand, they've had great economic success, but they also have huge expenditures that still need to be made on their own society. So there's this constant discussion of, how much are we going to put on defense? How much are we going to put onto social spending and infrastructure spending? And you can't have it all. So I think we're entering this period where tough decisions will need to be made.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I know that both the Russians and the Ukrainians are saying they want more territory than what they have, but if the war were to end with the red that you pictured in Ukraine, do you have a sense that the people living in that area would accept it?
I think especially in Ukraine and Russia, there's this sense of, probably more so in eastern Ukraine, where there's been so much terrible history that you just try to adapt to whatever the new reality is. So I think the territories that have been held by Russia for 10 years are much more likely to go along with being a part of Russia than the newer territories. Of course, the Ukrainians don't want to give up any territory. They don't want to set a precedent for that happening. But at this point, I think you'd pretty much need a full-scale war between NATO and Russia to do that, and that would end in totally unforeseen and probably devastating and much worse consequences than losing part of the territory. I will say, though, I don't think it's realistic to expect that you make concessions to Russia and that they will just cool it and that'll be fine. There's a lot of very violent, you could call it almost genocidal rhetoric among many Russian elites. There are people who are regarded as intellectuals and well-respected advisors to Putin who legitimize the use of nuclear weapons as a deterrent, so not even as a response to a nuclear attack, but there's all kinds of justifications for how nuclear weapons should be used. So I think there's a lot of very dangerous potential in the conflict, and that's why you've seen a lot of hesitance from a lot of Western countries as far as how much aid to give and what type of aid to give. Although I will quote the General Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who recently was, and this might have been a few months ago, but he did not oppose the idea of allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons to strike targets in Russia. Some have placed restrictions on the use of materiel they provide, asking that it only be used inside of Ukraine. And he says, it's for each and every ally to decide whether there are some caveats on what they deliver. And Stoltenberg said that to Radio Free Europe. He said that Ukraine's right to self-defense includes also striking legitimate military targets, Russian military targets outside Ukraine. And I think that may be part of the escalation in the near future, because it's a strange war where you can only shoot at your enemy within your own territory, but you can't go after his things, which they have been doing to an extent with these drones going after oil refineries, although President Biden also said, well, hold off on attacking the Russian oil refineries. So it's a constant balancing act that the Ukrainians are dealing with, and I think they want to be able to take the gloves off and go after at least the military targets and the logistical supply chain on Russian territory to really hurt the Russian offensive.
I have one while somebody else might be thinking about it. We're getting close to the end, by the way.
All right.
Ukraine, before all this started, had a pretty difficult governing profile, let's say.
Yeah.
There was a lot of corruption, a lot of money disappearing into various oligarchs' pockets and other folks at the high levels. The war has kind of put all that to the side, and now Ukraine's kind of the good guys, you know, in our sense, and in our view, in a lot of ways at least, a lot of people's eyes. Do they have a chance, if the war ends in any kind of reasonable way for them, do they have a chance of just bypassing that part of their history and coming up with a more solid government? I realize this isn't maybe your total area of expertise, but nonetheless, what do you think?
I think it depends how much pressure is put on by the West and how much they want to become part of the EU. Every country that became a part of the EU had to meet certain standards, and it'll take time, but I think it's doable for Ukraine. But at the same time, there are these deeply ingrained issues, and I think corruption almost doesn't quite describe it, because these are kind of cultural things that have developed over many generations that are very hard to root out and change. Even this grain crisis, it's not that, you know, little small Ukrainian farmers are being harmed here. These are very large companies controlled by oligarchs or foreign companies that have agricultural interests in Ukraine. So it's very hard to change those vested interests, but it depends how much they want to be part of the EU and how the leadership as well. This relates to that, but recently the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian forces was relieved by Zelensky, and this was received with a lot of anger and frustration, and is seen as a very political move, as it most likely was. So my contacts and people who've gone to Ukraine have told me that the Ukrainians, actually, there's a large amount, I don't know if they've done any polling on it, that are very frustrated and angry with their leaders when things like this happen, and they believe that more needs to be done to root out the corruption and to also, you know, have the right people in charge and not politically remove people that don't fit your agenda.
Thank you. Looking at the time, let's see, do we have another question? Let's go with one final one. Go.
I've got one.
Oh, we have one over there too. Let's do two more and then finish.
I've never have understood if Putin wants to take back this land.
Yeah.
I get that. Why is he destroying so much of it? The hospitals and the schools and the apartment buildings, is he just trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people so they're so beaten down they quit?
Yeah, I think it's a similar policy to what the Red Army was doing in World War II, that once you destroy what was there, you can rebuild what you want, even though it's costly to do so. It's part of the culture. I don't want to generalize too much about Russian culture, but at least among the leadership, there seems to be a very low regard for human life, and it's much different than what we have here in the West. So I think it's not really a problem for them. And their own soldiers, they're willing to sacrifice maybe as many as 100,000 or more, you know, dead, like double what we lost in Vietnam, but in 2 years. You know, it's astounding what's happened. So I think it's a cultural problem where it's a low regard for human life, and so what do they care about blowing up buildings if they care so little about human life?
Let's go over here.
Yeah.
Well, would you be willing to express your own views as to the cause and how the word Nazi was used in expressing cause?
I don't quite understand the question. Nazi in the context of?
Well, I don't either. And,
You mean the National Socialists or the?
well, the
Oh.
expectation along the border of the Russian-speaking people he mentioned it.
You mean that Putin believes that he's denazifying Ukraine? Is that what you're referring to?
I assume something along that order.
Okay. I mean, there was collaboration between some Ukrainians and the Nazis in World War II, but it's a far stretch to say that the Ukrainians are a Nazi regime and that justifies Putin's invasion. So I think Putin is very good at twisting and manipulating history, and this is a standard tactic used by the KGB, FSB, NKVD going back generations, where you offer some truth, but then you mix in the distortions and the lies. So I think that's a case there. But of course, there are elements of Ukrainian history that are very challenging, that need to be dealt with. There are elements of Polish history as well that need to be dealt with and are challenging. But I don't think Putin at all made a legitimate case for what he's doing in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Sure.
Let's take one more, and then we're past ending time, so one more.
Okay. I want to know if there is any interaction with Europe or simply peace, let's call it.
You mean for what Europe wants for Ukraine?
Yeah.
I think it's a mixed. There's a mix of opinions about what should happen. The countries that are closer to Ukraine and are under greater threat are more invested in Ukraine being defended and recovering its territory. The further you go to the west, the more I think flexible politicians are with just getting the war settled and getting back to some kind of business and trade with Russia. So I hope the side of not giving up wins out, but it's a balancing act, and that's the problem with Europe, is that you have so many countries with differing interests, and just being in the EU doesn't mean that you all suddenly believe the
I
same.
am frankly very, very worried about Europe.
Yeah.
If Trump became president and he made it very clear that he will not help Europe at all, and that would be the end.
I'm not as concerned personally. I think there's rhetoric involved, and he did say that he was behind Poland. I think he strongly supports Poland. And there was these comments that he made about how, Russia could go ahead and take whatever country's not paying up. The thing is that those aren't the countries that are under threat. So there's no, Russia's not going to jump over all these countries and attack Germany. That's one of their former partners. So I'm not as concerned. I think one thing is election rhetoric, and another thing is once you're faced with the realities, you're faced with the intelligence like our congressmen were faced recently, and they decided to pass the funding. So I think it'll be all right, but it's challenging times certainly, and I share your concern for Europe, especially as a Pole. We're right there, right behind Ukraine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you very much.